first blockchain-based technology platform that is focused on extreme poverty, refugees, as well as the migrant worker crisis that the world is facing today. And what we've really built is a blockchain-based application that allows us to bring a economic identity to the poorest parts of the world and the refugees. And there's a basic definition issue, and then we can get deeper into blockchain if you have any questions. The basic definition issue is that if you look at folks who are living in extreme poverty and the refugees and migrant workers, a lot of things happen to those people. So, for example, if you are a mother in Mogadishu, or if you're a family in the Zatri refugee camp, or if you're in the Dadaab refugee camp, you will get interactions from 5, 6, or 7 different aid agencies, social entrepreneurs, the UN, and so on and so forth, and you're receiving remittance money through the Hawala network. And all along, what you realize is these 6 or 7 or 8 data points, each one of them are sitting in the silos of the institutions that work with the families or the people in poverty. The biggest problem with that scenario, which is what the world is facing today, that's why we have 2.7 billion people living under $2 a day, 66 million almost refugees. These people cannot actually break the cycle of poverty or break the cycle of being stateless. And the reason is because things that happen to poor people or things that happen to refugees don't become part of their identity in terms of their health records, their land rights, their ability to capture their education data, or if you've been receiving remittance money through your son in Minneapolis who's sending it to his mom in Mogadishu through Hawala, you're not able to use that transaction history as a part of your identity. And that is the problem we are solving. We're solving a very fundamental problem in the humanitarian space using a for-profit model. And that's what BanQu does. We use blockchain. We are the first company to actually build a product on the blockchain that is working and operational. And we use the Ethereum blockchain. We do not do the mining side, which is we do not deal in cryptocurrencies. We've decoupled the mining aspects, and we use the pure blockchain because we believe that when we're trying to work with people in extreme poverty zones, especially like in Somalia and the Dadaab refugee camps and things like that, that we want to actually enable economic development activity instead of trying to make more money through cryptocurrency. So that's kind of a quick high level. I'll take a quick pause here, see if you have any questions. Otherwise, I can go deeper in terms of the live use cases, and specifically that is relevant to the Islamic community. As I was reading some of the context of this conference that you guys are having, I can talk about that, and then I can talk about supply chain, labor issues, and then farming rights and things like that. So, any questions?
Any questions, guys?
Well, if you can, education.
Go on, what's your question?
Could you expand on the education side?
Okay, so I'm not. Somebody's talking, so I just want to make sure if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I can walk you through a very systematic view of how we are using the blockchain in the world today.
Yeah, maybe.
Fabulous. Okay. So on the education side, one of the interesting things that we're seeing is there's a direct correlation between kind of just what we are calling the modern day slavery or child labor practices and the impact on education. So if a simple example, if you are a cocoa farming family in eastern Congo, there's really no good way to prevent the abusive practices or modern day slavery, which then directly impacts the ability of these children to attend school. So at a very basic level, what we're rolling out is a blockchain use case on our platform that allows us to create a blockchain identity or a blockchain marker, if you may, for the school, the teacher, and the students, and the attendance system. And then the farmers who have been farming in those lands have a blockchain identity, and their land rights and their production cycle is on the blockchain. And if you correlate those two, you can very quickly see if these children are actually attending, and if the product that is being produced is using practices such as modern day slavery. Now you can go to the next level on education and look at the actual content. A lot of the experience I've had in the last 4 years in places like Somalia and Zaatari camps and in Congo, there's a lot of education that's happening at a very primary elementary level. But then the next step of education that allows you to actually break the cycle of poverty is either not offered, or if it is offered, you're not able to leverage it. So a good example is I grew up in a slum in India, and I was able to get out of poverty because I was able to get access to learn how to program. And what happens in extreme poverty zones or in refugee camps, a lot of the education that is imparted to the folks, it doesn't become part of their education history record. And with the blockchain, once you have a degree or some sort of a vocational education, you can connect it to your identity, so then you can start using that as you move across from camps or you're in a global setting. So that's kind of the second layer. And then the third layer is the actual content of the actual content of the education set itself. Because what we're seeing in a lot of these emerging markets and emerging economies, blockchain offers a groundbreaking way of teaching kids, getting them excited about technology, especially girls, because there's a lot of focus on coding for girls, and blockchain kind of offers this distributed ledger concept that can leapfrog a lot of economies. So does that answer your question? Should I go deeper?
Yeah.
Yes, you were good. Any more questions, guys?
Great. So let me kind of dive a little bit deeper in terms of what we've built, who we work with, some of the success we've had, some of the challenges we continue to face. So BanQu really started back in 2014 out of an incident that happened. So I was lucky. I'd built and sold a couple of startups. I sold my last startup in 2012 and retired, and I became a volunteer CEO for a project for USAID in Eastern Congo. And I was basically creating technology solutions for agriculture, water, and healthcare from an integrated fashion. And in 2014, there was an incident that kind of changed my life, which was one of the women farmers in Congo had made $200 on a harvest. And what had happened was she wanted to open a bank account. But there were three factors against it. One is the local banking system would not recognize her rights as a woman, which is completely crazy in my mind. Two, she basically was, although she had been in Congo for 50 years, the fact that she had a piece of land, the fact that she had a harvest, the fact that she was participating with 1 acre fund, she was getting remittance money from her nephew in D.C., none of these data points really made her bankable in the bank's eyes. And third, because of that, the cost of borrowing was so high, and she had to go to the different networks to borrow. And what was interesting is in that 3-hour fight that I was having with the community bank, the guy kept saying, "I can bank you, but I cannot bank her." And that for me was a significant breakthrough, because at the end of the day, what I really learned is that in the developing world, the fact that identity doesn't have an economic value, which is 7 or 8 things that were in play: her land, her harvest, her mobile phone M-Pesa account. All of those things were very relevant, but the financial rails of the world were not recognizing it. So I basically took a step down from my volunteer CEO role, went back to my old team and started looking at the blockchain. And what the blockchain offered was something that, I've been in technology for 30 years, that hadn't been offered before, which is the ability to now empower that end user with data that is relevant to their life, data that allows them to build a credit profile, and more importantly enough, attach assets, right? So movable collateral and things like that would then allow them to drop the access to finance and things like that. So long story short, we started building the technology, we built a platform, and we've been live now in the last 6 or 7 months. We were very fortunate, with the success we've gotten so far. We just won the MIT competition for refugees in Amman. Just this week, we won the Cashless World Award in Belgium. And what we're trying to prove really is that everybody talks about identity. The flaw with that is identity is not limited to giving a number or things like that. What we're realizing the value of the identity is if the identity can be owned by the person in poverty, and if that identity has to it attached things like their land rights, their crop insurance, their production cycle, their birth records, and so on and so forth. And it all happens in a trust network because it's the blockchain. So let me take a pause here and see if you guys have any questions.
Shout out, people.
Or if this is even helping. Barbara, if I'm going off a tangent, feel free to cut me off.
Are they leveraging the crop insurance to initiate?
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Transactions?
If there are any questions, I'll take a pause. Otherwise, I'll kind of go. That's great crop insurance. So let me actually walk you through the live use case around crop insurance. We are in the process of doing a partnership with one of the largest insurance consortiums in the world. That's basically some of the biggest insurance companies. So let me address the transaction history and the liquidity part that somebody just brought up. So, but I'm going to walk you through a use case because it's important to understand the detail. So if you're a farmer right now in Rwanda or Congo or in Peru or Colombia, you're disintermediated 3 to 4 times by the brokers, right? What I mean by that is if I have a 1 acre plot that's producing some sort of a coffee or something like that, I'm sorry, I think I lost you guys. Can you guys...
Camera's gone rogue.
We can do it.
Let's see. Okay, that's better. Sorry. Yeah, you guys were seeing my knee, which is completely not interesting. But the point I was trying to make is when it comes to insurance, right? So let's talk through this. If I have a piece of land, and that piece of land is typically part of a cooperative, right? If you've been to Africa, and that cooperative then aggregates you, and then they work with a 1 acre fund, and that 1 acre fund will work with DFID, and DFID would work with somebody else. What's really happening is that the farmer, which is kind of the last mile, first mile, is always lost in the transaction. And this is kind of a disturbing, but it's a very true piece. And I actually got the chance to bring this up when I spoke at the General Assembly with the Secretary General and his team around the SDGs, because of direct relevance there. So what happens in today's world that farmer basically has a 1 acre plot. He or she gets aggregated at the co-op level, and they don't have good crop insurance because nobody really knows who the farmer is and where their land is and what sort of a rainfall pattern they're going to get. So what we've done is, in the pilots we're doing right now, is it's very simple. On the front and the back end's complex because of the platform we built. But the way it works is you're a farmer, you create a blockchain identity using basic biometrics like a thumbprint or a selfie. If you don't have a phone, you can just work with your cooperative to basically create an identity on the BanQu blockchain network. And then once you have an identity, nobody can ever steal it again. Once you've taken that basic identity, you can connect it to the local government's identity markers like an ID card or whatever. But most important is you walk around with a GPS-enabled phone, and now you can take the map of your land. The minute you've taken the map of your land, that piece of land is attached to your identity. Now, you might be thinking, like, well, how does that work for land rights? What happens in places like, Rwanda and Africa and in Latin America? If you have consensus, then the village agrees that your land is your land. That's how funerals are paid for. Once I have my piece of land that's attached to my economic identity on the blockchain, I can run a smart contract, which is the heart of what we do. That smart contract can generate a forecast. Once you've generated a forecast, 3 things happen. 1 is you can connect it directly to a buyer contract. 2, you can connect it to a climate service that basically tells you the rainfall pattern for your specific piece of land. And then 3, you can now triangulate your harvest, your land, and your rainfall pattern to a crop insurance product. Because now you have full transparency, full visibility in terms of the last mile, first mile. And if you take it a little bit further, now you can reduce the cost of borrowing. Because the reason why input loans on the seed side or the aggregation loans on the harvest side is so expensive is because A lends to B lends to DFID then lends to TechnoServe then gives the money to 1 acre fund. And now everybody's tagging their 3 to 4%, and the farmer at the end of the day is stuck with the 20 to 30% microloan, which makes no sense. And in addition, because the actual models that apply to crop insurance are not tied to the actual data point of the farmer, what happens is now you have what happened in Malawi, which is a run on the banks, because nobody really knew the rainfall patterns between two different plots of land that were a mile apart. So that's the kind of innovation we're bringing that then allows us to really focus and do what we call the last mile, first mile, and then one other step. So once you've got a base insurance product that's specific to your land, you can do a lot more other things. Like, for example, you can do things like, for example, that land is valuable. If you had a solar home system, now I can do smart metering at your specific house level. If you're doing smart metering, I can know what is the power consumption, which means I can now lend you, for example, a sewing machine because you have power from 6 to 10 at night. I can bring an online education platform for girls to get educated because you have power. And now suddenly that household has built an identity, which is the flaw in the SDGs. If you look at the UN SDGs, the flaw is that they're vertical solutions across 16 or 17 SDGs. And what we are proposing, and this is kind of a groundbreaking, kind of disruptive idea, is that the problem with that is everybody then offers a point solution. There's enough people who work on agriculture, water, healthcare, trust me, right, and supply chain. Yet the household then is fragmented across these SDGs. And then what happens is you never get out of poverty. Whereas if you take a blockchain approach, which is kind of this distributed ledger, that family is a household unit, and then the SDGs are interacting with the family unit. So again, let me take a pause there, see if you guys have any questions. I went on for too long a time, so sorry about that.
Who runs the nodes and governance?
Gosh, typing.
Who writes the notes?
Runs. Freudian slip.
Is that what he knows?
Oh, okay, so who runs? So from a governance and perspective, right, I think one of the interesting things is, so we run a permission-based blockchain, which allows you to participate and run your nodes. We do not run the public blockchain because of security reasons and the fact that we are working with such stressful populations in terms of refugees and extreme poverty zones. So the way it works is that you participate in the permissioned blockchain. We run across Microsoft and Amazon infrastructure. We do not touch the currency side. And the governance basically is part of the trust network of the organizations that have begun participating in our network. The nice thing about this is if we ever went out of business, it really doesn't compromise the identity or the data aspects from the user's level, which kind of distinguishes us from other models because in other models where they're not true blockchain applications, where they're still running a client server or a cloud-based database infrastructure, if that company went away, the blockchain application becomes useless, right? Whereas in our case, if we went away, the blockchain application stays intact because the identity is owned and operated at a biometric level by the person who actually created the identity. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Why is it not doing it? Any more, guys?
Great. So the use cases are unlimited. We focus primarily on, the fact that we have a platform that is up and running. We focus on being very open about the fact that as applications that are being developed, we can connect to those platforms. Our primary customers are banks and credit unions and financial institutions that are trying to get to the last mile. Our customers are large organizations and development agencies that are trying to figure out this last mile solution, and then obviously governments and things like that. We do not charge the folks in poverty zones or refugees. One of the biggest use cases, and just on the theme of what the Islamic scholar said is really we're trying to enable a conversation that this whole notion around remittance, especially in the Islamic world, is real, and that needs to be looked at from an investment perspective. Because I'll give you a live example. My business partner say. He was a Somali refugee himself. He spent 3.5 years in the Dadaab refugee camp. You can look him up. And he's been sending $100 to his mom for the last 15 years back in Mogadishu. But his mother is not creditworthy. And because he's been spending money through, I don't know, whatever the money transfer rate, Western Union, whoever it is, and then the Hawala network. And the problem with that is, the cost of sending money is extremely high for migrant workers or people who are refugees and settled in the U.S. But B, most importantly, that family unit that is receiving the remittance money has no ability to leverage that transaction. So if you look at a place like Guatemala, 50% of Guatemala's GDP is remittance. And if you think about it differently, and you say if that remittance actually becomes part of the credit profile at the receiving end, and you meet the KYC AML standards, now you've disrupted in a very, very major way, and you've actually doing economic development. And it affects, places like, Syria and Iraq and Mogadishu and other places, which is a real problem right now that we all need to address. Any questions?
What about user adoption? What about how easy is it or difficult is it for the refugees or the farmers or the children who are being educated to? Is it conceptually difficult?
Great question. User adoption. Actually, we found that user adoption is a lot easier than we thought. And I'll tell you what the challenges are. So the user adoption is extremely easy because, the conversation is not about blockchain. The conversation is very simple, which is going back to the mother in Congo that I interacted with 2 years ago. And the conversation is, you can actually now own the information about your land. You can walk into a bank or institution and say, hey, you know what, here's my identity and here's my land. Here's the transaction money that I'm getting from my remittance from my son in Minneapolis, and here's the harvest. If you show them, and that's how we basically, when we do a demo, we just show it. People don't need to know the blockchain. It works like a simple Facebook app. So people love it, right? So every time you sign up, and this is very true in kind of the family unit world. And since you guys were talking about finance in the Islamic community, we've found it's amazing when we work with the Somalis. It's because if you sign up a Somali family in Minneapolis, within the hour you'll have 10 other family members who live in Hargeisa or Jubaland or whatever have signed up because it's a trust network. Right? The fact that the blockchain is based on a trust network, people get it, so you don't even have to say blockchain. So we found that very easy user adoption. Where it is interesting or challenging is that it's at the institutional levels, because in many ways the blockchain redefines the landscape, right? The blockchain redefines the landscape because it basically questions or it looks at that landscape and says, hey, why would I have 15 brokers in the middle just to get my mom a packet of seeds so she can grow crop, right? And I think that's where people are starting to see that a lot of these middle layers in the supply chain will get disintermediated because they're corrupt and they're really not doing any good service to the mother. So that's kind of where the adoption becomes a little bit harder because people kind of feel threatened. But on the flip side, we've gotten some amazing response from folks like the UN and the aid agencies. In fact, I'm speaking at MIT this afternoon on a panel with USAID about the value of the blockchain when it comes to supply chain of medicines. Think about it. If I'm sending HIV medications into East or West Africa, a good amount of that is leakage or stolen or whatever. If you have a connection between the actual, so we do asset identities also. So if I have the actual malaria medication container with a blockchain identity, I have the health worker on the blockchain as well as the end consumer. I can easily triangulate the three, and I will have instantaneous knowledge of if the last mile was delivered or not. So the challenges are going to be more in terms of not understanding kind of the whole landscape of the blockchain, and institutions are still trying to figure that out. Does that help?
Any more questions?
Cool. Yeah, and I think one thing to remember, right, is I think a lot of there's a lot of miscommunication on the blockchain. There are no blockchain experts. I am not a blockchain expert. I have spent 2 years, and there are no experts, and we're all learning. Who holds the private key? So the private key is basically for us. We've patented a combination. So the private keys are distributed across the network, and it is held by the identity of the person themselves. So it is tied to your biometrics. So, for example, your thumbprint, your iris scan, and a combination of different phrases, and based on that combination you can open different sets of your records. So a certain combination opens your health record, a certain combination opens your land record, a certain combination opens your remittance history. And the reason why we do that is because at the end of the day, if you want to stay true to the blockchain, you don't want to have the private keys sitting out on a public server somewhere that a large corporation can have access to and things like that. So we truly are a decentralized model where the demand side, which is the family in poverty, actually owns their identity. Hope that answered. It's kind of funny. It's like a one-way dating where I'm doing all the talking and the other person is just typing. I'm just kidding. Any questions? Did that help answer? Oh, I love you guys too for your patience. And I don't know, I'm going to have to put in a customer service complaint into Microsoft for not letting Skype work. Any other questions? There's a lot of different use cases, but what about the transfers of assets to family? Oh, great question. So that's something called, we work with a lot of asset financing models. We work with a lot of organizations that are struggling with movable collateral, as well as governments, right? So one of the things that what we've done is, so if you look at what we patented the ability not only for the human identity to capture things like land records and birth registration and so on and so forth, but also asset. So you can do movable collateral, and because you can create an asset registry on the blockchain, you don't have to duplicate the paperwork, which means you can get rid of the corruption. So what you do is, if you are a farmer and you have a family unit that owns that land, that piece of land actually now has a blockchain title, quote unquote. And then when you're transferring the rights, it happens through a trust network, right? And it is recognized by the village, and then you've transferred the land rights, and you don't really have to mess around with corruption or people stealing. Now, obviously, right, 80-20, after all of this, you'll still find somebody who's going to come and try to steal, but since the data cannot be stolen, and let's just say you were ripped out of your home in Congo and now you were in a refugee camp in Rwanda, you still can go to a UN agent, put your thumbprint, and because it's a mobile site and it's on the internet, you can just pull up your identity and say, hey, this was me back in Goma, and here's my piece of land, and this is the information of my crop, and my son was sending me $100 each month. And that's where the property rights transfers become very relevant and very true in terms of empowering people. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
And the way we built the blockchain app, it's the family unit, the household has the hierarchy. So you can do parent-child, and then that way you can actually prevent a fair amount of fraud in the system. So basically, where sometimes you see where health care fraud in terms of people saying, well, this family unit has 17 siblings, and you've given 34 vaccinations, right? And all those things you can start addressing. Now, I'll be the first one to say, right, blockchain is not the end-all answer to all problems, but it provides a very unique solution set that, if applied the right way, can disrupt kind of the status quo around how we look at the developing world, because the developing world for the last 50 years has looked at this supply side, right? Everybody thinks we have something that we can give to the poor. And I think it's time we should shift that thinking and say, what if the identity was owned at the person level? What if the identity of the asset was, in a registry that didn't have to be duplicated? I think you can make some serious, significant changes, and you can make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Does that help?
Any more questions?
Cool. Well, feel free to push back. I don't have all the answers. Again, there are no experts. If somebody tells you they are, they're lying. We're all learning. The space, I was fortunate to meet with Vitalik a couple of weeks ago, the guy who started Ethereum, and he's learning too. Great. No more questions in the room. Fantastic. I'm glad this worked out in one way or the other. So thank you for the opportunity. Feel free to connect me, Barbara, if anybody has any follow-up questions.
Silent clap.
Cool. Have a good one and have a great rest of the conference. Big clapping. Okay, thank you. You guys are so cool. Thank you very much. Well, there was no throwing of tomatoes, so that's good. Last time I spoke, somebody threw an apple at me. Just kidding.
Wow. Okay. See you soon.